you're going to need a lot more money to retire than you think you do. And in this video, I want to explain to you why exactly I think this is the case. Let's get started. I'm going to start off with this video of Donald Trump saying that interest rates should drop to 1%.
It's something you sort of have or you don't have. They don't, the job he's done is just terrible. He ought to raise interest rates. You know, we should be at 1%. We should be leading the world. Instead, we're paying 4%. And if you look at what that means, that's over $1 trillion in interest that we have to pay. That with the striking of a pen, we would be saving more than $1 trillion. Is that right, Scott?
I want to give you a little bit more context on what he's referring to here. What he's saying here is that because the interest rate is 4%, because we're paying a high interest rate, the US national debt is costing the US government over $1 trillion in interest. You can see the number here. So this number is costing, to borrow this number, the US government has to pay $1 trillion in interest. And of course, Donald Trump doesn't like that because he wants to borrow more. He wants to spend more money so he can continue with all of the agendas that he wants to continue with, whatever his goals are with his administration. And keep in mind, this isn't meant to be political. I don't care what Donald Trump does or says. I'm not in the US. I'm not trying to give you my political opinion on Donald Trump. My point here is that the US dollar is fake money, and you're going to need a lot more money than you think whenever you retire. Because with that video, Donald Trump just proved that the US dollar is something that can be easily manipulated by one person. The person he was talking about there was the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who can, like Donald Trump said, strike a paper with a pen and change the interest rate. He can change the price at which your future is valued. So what Donald Trump is trying to do here is he's trying to bump this number up as much as possible while bumping this number down, because he knows that over time he'll be able to pay back whatever this debt is with money that's devalued. It's worth less. But the Federal Reserve doesn't want this. They don't want the US dollar to lose value very quickly. They don't want it to lose value rapidly, because if it loses value rapidly, then people will move to another store of value. So Donald Trump and the Federal Reserve have opposing views. They have opposing views on where the US dollar should go. Donald Trump wants the US dollar's value to go down rapidly and to just fall off a cliff, while the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell want the US dollar to lose value, but they want it to lose it slowly. So they're keeping interest rates up as an incentive to keep people from borrowing too many dollars, while Donald Trump wants to bring interest rates down so he can borrow as many dollars as he possibly can. And you can see from that video, he's a bully. He's going to do whatever he can to get rid of Jerome Powell and put somebody else into office so that they can lower the interest rate. And again, the significance here is that this shows you how truly weak the US dollar is. The US dollar will inflate rapidly if interest rates come down. If the interest rate goes from 4% to 1%, more people will borrow money, they'll spend more money. The money that you're going to get in the future is not worth as much if interest rates are low. If interest rates are low, there's no incentive for you to save. There's an incentive for you to spend. So if you don't save, if there's no incentive for you to save, you'll have less savings for the future because your bank doesn't want to give you an incentive to save. They don't want to give you an incentive to keep your money in your bank account. And this is one of the reasons why you need assets. Right now, bank accounts may be paying something like 3-4% interest. That number is going to drop. That number is going to fall rapidly. People are not going to have savings. If you save, you're going to be a loser in this economy. If you put your money in your bank account and you just hold on to cash, you're going to be a loser in this economy because the value of the US dollar is designed to decrease. One of the worst assumptions that a lot of people make is that inflation is 2%, when it's really not. It's not going to be 2% in 5, 10, 15 years. It's going to be higher and higher over time because we want interest rates to be decreased. The CPI can be manipulated by replacing the things that are in CPI. CPI is consumer price index. It's a basket of goods, and they measure the value of that basket every year. And they change the basket. They change what's in the basket. So we can see here the true inflation rate, especially when calculated using methodologies similar to those used in the 1980s, can be higher than the officially reported consumer price index suggests, specifically factoring in elements like housing costs and interest rates, which are part of the inflation calculation in the 1980s, but have been adjusted in modern CPI calculations, can result in a higher inflation rate. So they're changing the basket. They're telling you that inflation is a certain amount. So we can see here, uh, they're telling you that inflation is 2%, but based on 1980s methods, the estimated February inflation would be 11.5%. Yeah, do the research, try to figure out what these methods are, but over time they've been replacing things in the CPI basket to make it seem like inflation isn't actually as bad as it really is. They gaslight you by telling you that inflation is 2% because they want you to continue saving in their dollar. If you believe that inflation is much higher than 2%, you're not going to want to hold on to the dollar, meaning the dollar's value is going to rapidly fall. And that's exactly what Jerome Powell wants to avoid. His goal is to make it so that inflation remains at around 2%. If inflation goes to 10%, it decreases the trust that people have in US dollars. But if inflation goes negative, then the economy comes to a halt. Banks can't lend money because why would people borrow money to buy a house if the value of houses go down? Housing is where a lot of money is originating. So people borrow money to buy a house, the bank creates that money out of nothing, it adds it to the economy. If rates are lower, people have more of an incentive to borrow money to buy houses. And that means that house prices go up more because of supply and demand. If there's more money that's available to be borrowed, it means that the price of housing will go up higher because more dollars are chasing the same number of houses. You can print dollars, but you can't print houses. The reason why I think that you're going to need a lot more money than you think in retirement is because your expenses are going to grow a lot faster than whatever rate of inflation they tell you that they're going to grow at. The US government will try to tell you and they'll try to convince you that your expenses are only growing at 2% per year. So what people do is they assume that their cost of living is increasing at 2% per year. So they make their decisions based on 2% per year. So if you have a 2% inflation rate and the stock market is giving you 10%, you're really getting an 8% growth on your portfolio. But if inflation actually turns out to be 6% in that period, your growth is only 4% because 10% minus 6%, 4%. If your assumption on inflation is wrong and the numbers that they're feeding you are wrong, then you're pretty much screwed because your expenses are going to increase much, much faster. Now let's try to compare those two scenarios. So if inflation is 2% versus 5%, if you keep spending money on the same things that you spend today and you don't adjust your cost of living based on what the CPI has changed based on, your inflation rate will go up. So if it's 2%, and you're spending $5,000 a month today, in 2039, you'll be spending $6,600 a month. So we'll just remember that number. So 2039, $6,600 a month. If inflation is 5%, in 2039, you'll be spending $9,900 a month. So you'd go from, at 2%, you'd go from $6,600 a month to at 5%, you would go to almost $10,000 a month. So your monthly expenses are going to increase by 50%. Your annual expenses are also going to increase by 50%, of course, based on 2% versus 5%. The reason why I'm saying this is because I used to be one of those people who used to invest in index funds. I used to believe in stocks and the real estate market because they gave you a 10% return and inflation is 2%. So if I get a 10% return, I'm beating the market by 8%. But the reality is that you have to dig deeper. You have to try to figure out what the actual inflation rate is. The real inflation rate is not 2%. I don't know what the real inflation rate is. Inflation is constantly changing. It depends on what you buy on a day-to-day basis in your life. But for some people, it could be 20% per year. If you buy really high quality products, you can see that those products are actually increasing in value very, very quickly. For example, when I first started really paying attention to prices, this was something like 2021, 2022, I'd see that ground beef, lean ground beef, organic lean ground beef at Costco was $25 for 4 pounds. So something like $6 a pound, six Canadian dollars a pound. At that time, non-organic, non-grass fed ground beef was something like $9.99 a kilogram. Today, the non-organic has gone up to something like $12 a kilogram, while the Organic, grass fed is now $40 for that same package that cost $25 before. So the thing that can be basically mass produced and the animals can be treated badly has gone up 20%, while the one that can't be mass produced has gone up 60%. So that difference right there is huge. If you're buying organic grass fed ground beef, your cost of eating has gone up 60% for those meals. So I don't know what your inflation rate is going to be. I would suggest that you keep a track of what you're paying for things and you try to pay attention to how much your cost of living is going up and try to be more realistic instead of assuming that inflation is going to be 2%. The good thing here is that with Bitcoin, either way, you're fine. If inflation goes much higher than you expect, you'll be okay because Bitcoin's growth rate is much, much faster than whatever CPI is, whatever true inflation is. Even if the inflation rate was 10%, at some point you would be financially free because Bitcoin is constantly outperforming the inflation rate. It's constantly outperforming 10% per year. We can see the returns from Bitcoin here. In the last 4 years, the compound annual growth rate has been 37%. In the last 3 years, 74%. In the last 6 years, it's at 52%. 7 years, 46%. These are the lowest returns. I don't want to really talk about the other ones because they seem too high. Most people are turned off by numbers that are too high. They think that I'm a moon boy when I say that Bitcoin is going to $1 million, when $1 million is just right around the corner. So, how much will you actually need to retire? I would estimate that if you have stocks, you should probably retire with 30 to 35 times whatever your annual expenses are. But with Bitcoin, you can retire with about 10 to 15 times whatever your annual expenses are. So in this case here, if inflation is 2%, you'd probably need something like $3 million in stocks to retire in 2040 if your expenses are about $81,000 a year. But if you have Bitcoin, you can multiply this by 15 times, you'd have about $1.2 million. The way that I see it, if you have 15 times your annual expenses in Bitcoin, in that first year, you're going to be able to withdraw 6% of your portfolio to pay for your expenses, and you'll still have the rest of that Bitcoin. The 94% will continue to grow at 20, 30, 40% per year. With the stock market, you can only take out 3 to 4%. And even then, you can only retire for 30 years. If you retire for longer than 30 years, you might be in trouble. With Bitcoin, because the growth is so much faster than stocks, you're going to see that whatever your withdrawals are from that first year will be covered by the returns in the second year. Now, keep in mind that it may not be that consistent. You'll probably have to wait 4 years in order to make back your money. I would also recommend that you have a little bit of a fiat stack to pay for your expenses so you don't have to sell your Bitcoin in case the price comes down. Most people think you can just retire with $1 million, but I don't think that's going to be the case because over time, the value of that $1 million keeps decreasing. Over time, there are more millionaires. These people can all spend their money to buy the things that you want and they can compete with you to pay for those things. And you may not be able to afford them because if they have more money than you, they can pay more for the things that they need. So if you want to retire today, you may need $3 million based on your situation. But if you want to retire in 20 years, that number may be completely different from whatever the number is today. I made a spreadsheet here based on the Trinity study, which is using a 4% rule. So you withdraw 4% of your portfolio to pay for your expenses and you adjust it for inflation. I don't know if these numbers apply anymore. I don't know if the 4% rule would even be accurate anymore. I think you may need a lot more than this. So you may actually need to use a 3% rule. So instead of dividing your expenses by 4%, you may need to divide it by 3% to get a more accurate figure of how much money you need to retire. So in this example, you would have gone from $1.625 million based on the 4% rule to $2.166 million based on the 3% rule. So based on that assumption, you would have gone from needing $1.625 million to retire if you use the 4% rule. But if you use the 3% rule to retire today with $65,000, you would need $2.16 million worth of stocks. If you make the wrong assumptions today about what inflation will be, you're going to make the wrong decisions about how much money you need to retire. And at some point, you're either going to have to go back to your job or you're going to have to work longer before you can even retire in the first place. The difference between somebody assuming that inflation is 2% and somebody assuming that inflation is 10% could be massive, massive. There's a spread of probably $10 million if you want to retire today if you assume inflation is going to be 2% versus 10. If you think inflation is going to be 10%, you're going to need way more money in your stock portfolio in order to retire at some point. And I actually think that 10% may be pretty accurate or close to accurate, even 7 to 8%, because I would assume that most people's expenses are rising 7 to 8% per year. If your rent is rising 10% per year and everything else doesn't rise that fast, your overall inflation rate would probably be more than 5%. But then when you add food, because food is a massive part of everybody's life, they have to spend money on food no matter what, and food is increasing very rapidly. The inflation rate at 2% seems like a lie. And I know for a fact that that's not going to be the case over the next 30, 40, 50 years. You're not going to see 2% inflation. You're going to see the estimates that we're using today being completely wrong. People are going to be talking about this for decades, thinking about how we got fooled into thinking that the US dollar is only losing 2% per year. So if you're saving in stocks, redo those numbers. You have to run those numbers again, because if you don't, then you're going to be in trouble by the time you retire. If you have any questions for me about this, if you want me to run the numbers for you, you can book a meeting with me in the link in the description below. Other than that, I really appreciate that you watched this video all the way till the end. Leave a thumbs up if you found value here. It really helps with my channel.